Hello, everyone. I'm Anthony Mills, the Executive Director of Global Innovation Institute. Thank you for joining us today. Today we have in our webinar an author panel discussion for the book, The Other Side of Growth. I will share that cover with you very briefly. So you see here the book. The book is entitled The Other Side of Growth, An Innovator's Responsibilities in an Emerging World. Now, this book was written by 9 of us who serve on the board of directors at Global Innovation Institute. And I'm going to briefly introduce each individual by name and title that is a contributor. And then after I do that, I'm going to in turn turn it over to each author, and each author is going to give about a 3-minute explanation of their chapter, their contribution to the book, including the key highlights and what was important to them and the main points of the book. So with that, let me introduce the authors. First of all, I have myself, as I mentioned. I'm the Executive Director of Global Innovation Institute. I'm Anthony Mills. Then we have Dr. Larry Schmidt. Larry is the co-founder and managing partner of the Innovo Group in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And then we have Dr. Bettina von Stam. Bettina is the founder of the Innovation Leadership Forum, as well as Director of Awards at Caterva. She's based in the London, UK area. Then we have Mr. Steve Wells. Steve is the Director of Insights at Legacy Innovation Group in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Then we have Mr. Michael Graber. Michael's the Managing Partner at Southern Growth Studio in Memphis, Tennessee. Then we'll have Ms. Teresa Spangler. Teresa is the founder and CEO of Plaza Bridge Group in Durham, North Carolina. Then we'll have Mr. Brian Mattimore. Brian is the co-founder and chief idea guy at Growth Engine in Stamford, Connecticut. And then finally, we'll have Mr. Mike Pinder, the senior innovation consultant based in Antwerp, Belgium, working there. So with that, that is our authors. Please join me in welcoming the authors. And, let me just tell you very briefly before I give it to the first author, the general premise of the book, and then we'll start with the first author. So the general premise of the book is really inviting business leaders to think about the innovations they're developing and launching and the impacts those innovations have for all stakeholders across the spectrum of the business, and thinking about how they're leveraging innovation to drive corporate growth, and are they doing so in a way that benefits all stakeholders. So that's the general premise. So with that, now I'm going to turn it over to our first author, Dr. Larry Schmidt. Larry, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Anthony. I appreciate it, and welcome to everyone on the webinar. I had the privilege of writing a chapter for this book, and in the course of doing the research and talking to a number of people, I came to the realization that many innovators in the companies they work for don't really have the right types of tools and mechanisms and methods to think about the purpose-driven aspects of what it is they are creating. I've been in the innovation business for 20 years, working with a large number of companies. I've never met an innovator yet within a large company that didn't want their innovation to do good, okay, to benefit the world, okay, to be a benefit for individuals and for others. The problem is that often they lack the imagination to think about things that could possibly go wrong, all right? And number two, they lack the influence, even if they do anticipate things that could go wrong, to direct the company and their customers and stuff to use their products in the right way. So what I try to do in the chapter here is to lay out some of the issues that innovators face once they've come up with the new concept. It starts to gain traction within the company. It starts to be scaled. It starts to get more and more resources applied to it. They start to lose control over the concept, and it morphs into something different than what they had originally planned for. It starts to be co-opted by the operational excellence arms of the company, whose main purpose and focus usually is making a profit. All right, and so you have these forces of profit that are going against some of the better outcomes of an innovation, and you end up with things that you didn't expect. You end up with things that are not all that good for society. We see an example of this playing out right now with the whole Robinhood investment application, where the founders clearly did not anticipate, although one could claim that they could, they clearly did not anticipate all of the negative things that investors on their platform would do. Just for those of you who don't know, Robinhood is an investment app that allows anyone to invest for free buying fractional shares. So you can buy $5 of Apple if you want to. But they also let people go on margin. They also encourage people to buy options and stuff. And the results of that have been very negative in a lot of ways. So these types of things can be anticipated. And one of the things that I try to do in the chapter is give the innovator some tools for anticipating it. And the main focus, the main tool that's introduced is something called the social model canvas, which allows an innovator to think about how can the product, could the product evolve over time? How will people use it in ways that you don't anticipate? How will others adopt it and appropriate it and develop products based on your concept that do other things? And then finally, how will government and society ultimately judge the product 10 years from now when it's out in the world and it hasn't quite gone the way that you anticipate? So we've had the privilege of working with a couple of companies since the book has come out. I found it very encouraging that since Anthony recruited me and we started talking, I've been much more explicit about talking about the purpose-driven aspects of innovation with our clients. And I've been very encouraged by the positive response of people in those companies who really want to do this and want to do right and just need the tools and the mechanisms in order to do it. So.
Thank you very much, Larry. And I encourage everyone obviously to get a copy of this book. You can buy it at Amazon.com or you can buy it through JNI, but to actually study the social model canvas that Larry and his colleagues have developed, and it invites the innovator to look at the evolution of the innovation, the alternative use, the reputation and policy involved, and the appropriation and so forth. So there's very specific areas that it has you to examine, and we appreciate you introducing that tool in this book, Larry. It's very good.
Thank you.
All right. So next up, we're going to have Dr. Bettina von Stam, and Bettina has written a chapter in the book called Innovation, Beware of the Dark Side. So Bettina, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Anthony. Yes, indeed, beware of the dark side of innovation. And I'd like to connect straight to what Larry said about purpose and the lack of purpose very, very often for innovation. And I find that if you go and ask CEOs or ask the people in organizations, why do you innovate? They look slightly puzzled, as if, well, obviously everyone is innovating and innovation is an organization's lifeblood. We all know that. I agree, and I also think it needs to be a little bit more than that. And I possibly also want to contradict Larry a little bit, that all innovation is meant to do good, possibly in the ultimate sense, but very often this doing good is associated with giving the people what they want, which is maybe not always the best thing. So, for example, people want fruit that looks nice and round and it's got all the same shape, which is what the companies want, because then it's easier to package and the customer wants it to look nice. And in the process of creating this kind of fruit and this kind of food, it's lost a huge percentage of its nutritional value. That for me is the purpose of innovation really to make things look good rather than be good, would be one of the questions. And the fact that by making it look good, we are losing its original purpose, which is provide nutrition to people, is the first aspect of the dark side. A second aspect I would like to mention in this brief introduction, there are a few more in the chapter, is that I think we've just got too much innovation. because everyone is so excited. Woo, we must innovate, and we must have lots of innovation. And the question is, how much innovation do we really want or need? Particularly in the electronic consumer goods markets, there seems to be constant stream of in the introduction of new models, not really things that are entirely new, but constantly new models. It's sort of, we can get quite addicted to newness and to the latest technologies. People change their phones, for example, their mobile phones much more frequently than they would actually have to, which results in about, let me just check the figure, in about 50 million tons of electronic waste in 2019, only 20% of which are being recycled. So I think there needs to be more questioning how much is really desirable and beneficial, and do we need all those new models and new variations and so on and so forth. And I think that's enough for now. I gladly hand over to the next person. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Bettina. I mean, that's very good. And I think you're right. I mean, one of the things we've always taught is innovation is not pursued for the sake of innovation in itself. And it's innovation is not an end in itself. There's purpose. And if I think about what you've written and what Larry's written and I put them together, I mean, what strikes me is that if an organization truly has a deeper purpose, or a truly deep purpose, and follows that deep purpose, then I think they are going to think much more comprehensively about the innovations to deliver and do it much more thoughtfully and deliver really meaningful innovations that do benefit and not just innovation for the sake of innovation. So excellent point. I think those complement each other very well. So next up, we have Mr. Steve Wells. Steve has written a chapter in the book called The Foundations of Moral Innovation, which is a very interesting chapter. Steve, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Anthony. About 25 or 30 years ago here in the United States, in the field of education, there was a lot of discussion about adding values to the curricula. And everybody seemed to be on board with that. It was an exciting idea, but very quickly, the conversation went from, yes, we should have values in education, to what values and whose values? And it got a lot more sticky after that. Values are a reflection of our moral understanding, and they're not that simple, and they're not that agreed on universally. So that was the problem there. My motivation in writing this essay, this chapter for the book, was to argue for finding the most solid base that we can for values-based innovation. Why is that important? Well, without a solid foundation where many people can agree with the values that we espouse, what is considered a value or something that is considered moral can shift. It can be a subtle shift or it can be a dramatic shift. But we end up with a situation where the things that we value or consider moral are really a flavor of the month. They just drift over time with whatever the loudest voices are saying at that time. And so ultimately, it can be not that helpful at all, in the same way that it was not that helpful in education. Perhaps ironically, I argue for agreed on values based on religion, the major religions of the world, one of the most disagreed on topics. But the disagreement in the field of religion is really about truth claims. And that's not relevant to what we're talking about here, at least in this chapter that I wrote. It's true that most major religions differ on these points of their truth claims, but they do share a lot of key values. And millions and millions of people around the world agree with these values. The religious impulse has always existed throughout all of recorded history. And these values that these different religious traditions share have been accepted and valued by their adherents for millennia. So the essay begins by recognizing that due to past innovation failures or the negative consequences that were not anticipated, there has become an increasing awareness, particularly among younger generations, that there is a need for moral responsibility. And I believe that we are at an inflection point in history when this awareness for moral responsibility in innovation is upon us, and this wave of interest and passion, it puts us at a key moment when we can make a difference. The essay builds the case for using the shared values of these religious traditions, and I give some examples in the chapter. The two main areas of value and morality that I focus on in the chapter are the dignity of people and stewardship care for nature. Innovators and innovative organizations have an opportunity today because we're at this inflection point. Innovators and innovative organizations are really trail guides to the future for people who follow them or who are impacted by their innovations. We have the opportunity to lead others, to create ethical practices and outcomes, to do good to our neighbors and to care for the earth. And I think most people would agree it's hard to argue with that.
Very good. Thank you very much, Steve. You know, and one of the things you did in your chapter was you coined a new word that appears for the first time in the English lexicon, and that word is neolatry. Can you explain to us what the word neolatry means?
Yes, neolatry is a portmanteau word combining two different things: neo, the prefix that means new, and idolatry. And the idea of neolatry is that, you know, as Bettina was saying, there are people who just think that everything new is great. And so we need more innovation. And they plunge forward because if it's new, it's got to be great. And there's an uncritical acceptance that if something's an innovation, there's nothing that can possibly go wrong. And so we have this sort of worshipful attitude towards anything new. DYG, Daniel Yankelovich Group, the social trends research company who monitors social trends, talks about this. And they say that we tend to have a pattern of what they call lurch and learn. We lurch forward, and then all of a sudden we find all these unintended consequences, and we learn, and we pull back from this plunge forward that we've taken. So I think part of what all of the authors of this book point to is the need to be more cognizant of the potential negative impacts of innovations, and letting that be as much a guide as to us as profit might be, or even doing good in the world. Just being a lot more aware of that tendency.
Yes, very good, Steve. Yeah, obviously try to avoid the basically worshiping what's new simply because it's new, but really pursuing things new for a true purpose. Very good.
Exactly. Yeah.
So next up is Mr. Michael Graver. Michael has written a chapter in the book entitled "The Future is Conscious, and Organizations Must Model this Humanizing Practice to Prosper." So Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Anthony. I would just want to say what a joy it is to be with my colleagues. It's always a deep dose of inspiration. So thank you. I also invite any of you to link in with me. I love connecting with innovators across the globe. It's a great joy. There's no denying that we have three major crises across the globe right now, right? We have an environmental crisis, and a lot of this addiction to new and novel and more makes oceans of plastic, right? We just, there's so much stuff that isn't really useful, that's created just for the low watt sake of making money, right? Money's not bad in itself, but needs a broader context. So the first is the environmental collapse. The second would be the humanitarian crisis. We've never seen so many refugees just afoot in across the globe. And with that, we have all of the nationalisms and tribalisms and other pieces. It truly is causing great havoc that we've got to understand as a global community. And then third is a crisis of truth and meaning, you know, that you could just look at the insurrection at the United States Capitol to see that we are living in separate realities at once. And because of all this divisiveness, the more we focus just on the artifacts of innovation for the sake of making money, the less we're taking these tools and using them for what I'll call a a more rooted and holistic purpose. So what I have learned, being what I'll call a spy in the House of Commerce, working with 250 clients across the globe, helping them set up innovations and commercialize them, is that the real purpose and thrill and bliss of innovation is watching people become alive. And nobody is at fault for these three crises, right? We can all point fingers and say this person, this ideology, but we all are, because that's our template that we've learned in the Industrial Revolution, was to compartmentalize, was to think about things as resources, right? Was to think about things in very limited, dehumanizing way. Even the way we are taught about marketing, business to business, business to consumer, to hit the mark is an archery term, literally. You hit the mark, right? And it objectifies instead of looking at the humans as a subject. And what I see is, by doing innovation in many organizations, for-profits, nonprofits, is that we are at the birth point of a new era. And I call this era the human to human era, right? Instead of the old era. And so I want to welcome you to this era, and welcome you as, I'll call it, living cells in a dying body, as we are recreating how this species works in the planet to make it sustainable for all life forms, right? So with that, I just want to say thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. I appreciate that. And one of the things I really loved about your chapter is that it really reinforces the need for us to humanize innovation and really to keep the humanity front and center in the process. And I think that goes hand in glove with what, Larry and Bettina were talking about with purpose-driven innovation. I think if we have a really true deep purpose in what we're doing, and a purpose centers around humanity, that really keeps that the purpose as a true north compass steering us in the right direction. So
yeah. So
really,
yeah, Anthony, I'll just say that is so true. But then the most interesting thing is that the firms that do that prosper better anyway, in multiple ways. Typically, they outperform profit-only companies 17-1, according to a great study called Firms of Endearment. But then they also are more responsible to their stakeholders and more responsible to the planet. So it is a win-win-win.
Yeah, and you're right. The research has borne out that having this sort of focus with a proper purpose and a humanistic purpose definitely does actually pay off in the long run on the bottom line, for sure, in the growth of the business. So thank you again, Michael. I really appreciate that. So next up, we have Ms. Teresa Spangler, and Teresa has written a chapter in the book entitled Breaking the Paradoxes to Innovate for Good. So with that, I give Teresa the floor.
Thank you, Anthony. Thanks, everyone. Yeah, breaking the paradoxes. I took a look at what we've all been talking about so far in that purpose-driven innovation. And then you look at where the priorities have typically in past been, and it's profit first. And so it conflicts sometimes with this purpose-driven, which may take longer, where we're looking for profit first and we're looking for speed. So what I looked at and really looked at how Plaza Bridge Group has been working with our clients all over the world, where the struggles are in getting innovation out the door into this commercialized world, and looking at the just big list of innovations, their assets, all these things they have sitting on the shelf that they're trying to move through, and what challenges they face. So one of the things I really wanted to focus on here was the frameworks that help to drive innovation forward, and to put in context how we can ask the bigger what if questions to get past this profit first. And everyone's been talking about purpose. And so one of the first things I looked at, which is very true, is that if we don't have a purpose, if we're not telling the story of what is this innovation going to do, and incorporating it, not just having that purpose, it needs to be incorporated in the vision. What is the vision ultimately in values that we're bringing to humanity, to society? How are those impacts? And one of the models that I looked at was Stanford Social's Innovation Reviews model around a framework that they've highlighted. And so it's the clarity of the purpose and it's in those statements, but using this model to say and ask the questions in each case when you're defining that to what does your innovation have that is relevant to making it humanistic? How is it non-hierarchical, meaning that we're taking in, an input from every walks of life and society and diversity. It's also making it participatory. So much innovation is domain expertise. We get it to the door, but then we forgot to talk to people and include them in that innovation. So it's inclusive. How are we getting people input and being a participant in that design of the innovation? And then certainly thinking about sustainability, and that those four things help us define the values and the purpose in a framework. I also looked at, and we do a lot of ESG, for those that don't know, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and under that they have their environmental, societal, and governance program, which I think is one of the most incredible frameworks, if you will, to look at how they have put an initiative that allows any company in the world to participate in 17 development goals that they want to create a better world by 2030. And so what they've done is they didn't just say, this is what we want to do. They created a framework that gives a platform for companies to be able to participate in that. And I talk a lot about that. I think it was really an excellent framework. And then in innovation, it's a purpose-driven innovation. If I have an ESG strategy and it's driving through every part of the company, and we all can enroll in that vision of what is it that we're trying to do that's good here. I think the third thing that I really wanted to look at is that what are some of those most challenging things to get innovation out the door? I take, for an example, 3D printed organs, just wrought with, I mean, it's possible, it's already out there, people are doing it. And it's, we worked with a company that was making 3D printed organs years ago. The regulatory and governance and compliances are the barriers to getting some of this innovation out the door. So one of the things I found was a wonderful documentary by Patrick Ressner, who was the director of this documentary, that says They Say It Can't Be Done. And talking with Patrick in an interview, learning and taking his feedback and his learnings from all the companies he talked to that struggle to get this great innovation out that does help human and society and environment. And what could we do? And here are 4 points that we discussed around that, which I think would help, is that you engage regulators and government agencies early in the process, get them involved and enroll them in this idea of what you're trying to do all along the path. Create your ambassadors that are your Imagineers. You want imagination, you want big thinking, you want them to be on the positive side, because there are going to be so many barriers in this getting this innovation out the door. Who are those that are going to help to maintain this idea and why it's so critical? That brings up optimism. We want to keep the optimistic innovation because there's so many people that want to they'll share the downsides. It's important to have that, but you want to stay optimistic in those that you believe in. And then celebrating those milestones. I guess the fourth point in this is I talk about the action, and that Philips Corporation very succinctly puts it that if you are focused on this purpose-driven vision and you are building something better for society, that success does come. It is a competitive advantage and those profits will follow. And so I will end with that. It's just a really powerful statement.
Thank you so much, Teresa. It is very powerful indeed, and very well written. And I really appreciate the points you made from the documentary. I think they fit very well with what we're trying to accomplish here. So very well said. So next we have Mr. Brian Matamore, and Brian has written a chapter in the book called Organizational Values, an essential tool for creating a culture of innovation. So Brian, the floor is yours.
Well, great. Thank you, Anthony. Hello, everyone. Yeah, I think you'll find that what I'm going to share with you here is very much aligned with all of my co-authors. As an innovation agency now for 20 years, like my co-authors, we have to operationalize these ideas that we're talking about. So let me just share a quick story and then talk about some of the points I make in the chapter. It was right around it was soon after 9/11. Con Ed was one of my clients. They'd asked me to give a talk on creativity and innovation to their senior leaders. And you probably know that they had done just a masterful job of bringing power back to Lower Manhattan. You know, they were working 48 hours straight, et cetera, et cetera. It was heroic. And I felt somewhat embarrassed to be talking to these folks who had done heroic things. And as I said in the chapter, I'm watching TV home and drinking Diet Cokes. And so I said, what is some way I could empathize with what they went through? And so I went to senior management, and they allowed me to spend a day with these workers. And so I was out on the trucks. And what I did when I was on the trucks, I had my hard hat on, et cetera, et cetera. I'm crawling through Rockefeller Center, the steam pipes, trying to stop the leaks, et cetera. It was great. But I asked two questions. And the two questions I asked were, the first was the Peter Drucker question of everyone I saw at Con Ed. And that question is, what's the one thing you would do to improve our company? And the second one was the key one, because that was the one that led to the eureka moment for me. And that was, what are you most proud of what you've done here at Con Ed? And some of these folks I talked to were 25, 30-year veterans. And I was shocked because everyone I talked to said that it was something that they had created, that the company did, a new idea they had that the company operationalized and instituted, that made the difference and that they were most proud of. This guy Mo I was with, he had the idea of using cell phones to stay in better touch, et cetera, et cetera. But that for me was a eureka moment, because I realized that organizations are not necessarily humanizing, purpose-driven, doing a good job of helping people contribute ideas. And of course, suggestion boxes have been terrible, et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, my chapter is really about how you operationalize that. And I went back to first principles, much like Elon Musk does. And that led to vision, mission, and values. And of course, we do some of that work with our clients, and particularly around values. And so what we've discovered and what we do now with our clients is we ask them to really, sort of align with what their values are. And when we looked at every middle size and large size organization, they all in some way popularize and support the idea of innovation or creativity, right? And the best example we found was Zappos. So they have 10 values. There's, I'll share three of them. One is embrace and drive change. Another one is be adventurous, creative, and open-minded. And the last one is create fun and a little weirdness. And in that sense, they're like every other middle-sized and large organization. They have these values. And so I saw these as a justification then for senior leaders, middle managers, and the people on the front line then to manifest these values, because the company's saying they want them, right? And so what we do with our clients is we have them have every employee in small workshops figure out how to manifest those values in terms of behavior change, right, in their daily jobs. And this has been an extraordinary tool then for creating that kind of organizational change we're looking for, manifesting the purpose-driven nature of it, right? And secondly, if you will, humanizing the organization. So just one quick example, one of our clients, they have a monthly newsletter, one each month about a different value. And so be a pioneer or whatever it is. And so it's an extraordinary thing when you see an organization really living its values, to taking it off the wall and having people really live these and the behavior change that come from that. And ultimately, it's all about the humanization of the organization.
Very good. Thank you, Brian. I think your chapter is a great contribution to this book and what all the other authors are saying, because there's such a tight alignment between vision and purpose, and values, I should say. Organizations that have a well-stated purpose tend to come up with values that reinforce that purpose, that support that purpose. And that, I think that leads to some of the great values in organization, like you mentioned. And I think having the purpose helps them to live out those values and keeps them on the right path. So thank you again for your contribution.
Sure.
Next up, we have Mr. Mike Pinder. Mike has written a chapter in the book called Innovation Has a Much Bigger Role to Play, which is, to me, is one of the very exciting perspectives shared in the book. So I look forward to hearing Mike. Mike, the floor is yours.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Anthony, and hello, everybody. And yeah, it's like has been said, it's an absolute pleasure to be working on this kind of book, looking at many different lenses around innovation from all sorts of different points of view. The lens that I was taking was about the future role of innovation, and the purpose was to really take stock of where innovation is today, and then specifically highlight what I see it needs to do by working with corporate Fortune 500s all over the world, to tackle the big ecosystem level challenges. So it's really building on the discussion so far, but looking at the how and the what needs to happen specifically as you apply innovation. So I really wanted to shake up the innovation community. I see us as the people responsible with the responsibility and the privileged position to make those changes. And as we've seen, innovation tends to be seen as something positive and good for us, but it's fundamentally linked to our economic logic, our culture, our values, and it can have all these negative consequences as we've been looking at. We've done a lot of work over the last 20 years to imitate the way startups are innovating, and the speed of innovation is accelerating, and we're trying to codify that in large corporates. And so in doing that, we've perfected the art of this customer centricity process, putting the customer first, then looking at the economic viability, and then the technical feasibility, very much in that order. But that starts to break down when you apply that to trying to tackle very complex, wicked multi-ecosystem challenges that go across international boundaries. Suddenly, just being customer centric isn't enough. So, what do we need to do as practitioners to evolve it? The other element is a lot of innovation can result in a lot of theater in large corporates, being seen to innovate rather than actually having ESG impact innovation coming out of it. How do we avoid that? So what I wanted to give as takeaways from this chapter was a positive kind of direction as to what we should do, and that's to go further than just having a customer-centric perspective and develop more nuanced approaches that take in multiple stakeholder perspectives, navigating the challenges between governments, regional levels, public and private institutions. We need to develop a new front end of the innovation process that is linked to the vision and purpose that we've all been talking about, with strategic objectives at the end of it. And just having a one-size-fits-all approach, like using design thinking, lean startup, and business model innovation, won't necessarily get there. We need to find ways, like World Economic Forum's recently launched Scale 360 initiative, that's designed to sit at the government level across the world, working with the UN sustainability goals to foster that initial strategy formation for innovation types, and then designing initiatives to help solve them. So it's beginning to start to navigate the complexities of the bigger challenges that innovation has to solve. We don't have any choices. So it's really about us as practitioners redesigning that front end of the innovation process, designing new, optimal processes for the innovation types we're looking at, to help us navigate the tensions between exploring new opportunities and the tensions that creates whilst exploiting the existing ones within organizations. And so at the end of it, I wanted to reframe innovation as thinking about global sustainability, which is that purpose element that all the authors are talking about as well, and then framing the start of innovation around the ecosystem, not just around the customer desirability. So thinking systemically about innovation, not just customer centricity. Then obviously it needs to have a sustainable business model, and it needs to be technical feasible, but rethinking that front end was really the key message I wanted to put forward. So yeah, that was my chapter. It was a very fun writing it as well.
Very good. Thank you, Mike. And I think that was a crucial point that you've made, that we really have to link the whole front end of innovation to this sense of purpose and the values in the organization, and a really good purpose. Otherwise, we end up charting off on all sorts of innovations that may not take us in the right direction and have the right impact. So making that new connection between the front end and the purpose is critical. So very much appreciate that input. So the final chapter of the book was actually authored by myself, and it's entitled Inflections of Hope. And the general theme of what I was trying to show in this chapter is that I think over the last 20 years, there actually have been very good indicators along the way, mileposts along the journey, if you will, that show us that the world, I think, is, and business leaders are awakening. There is an awakening to realize that, hey, there's more to business than simply making profit and pursuing your innovation for the sake of innovation or the sake of just generating more profit, that there's actually much more to it. Business has a larger role to play and has much more responsibility. So what I've done is I've actually tried to explain specific, what I call inflection points and an inflection curve that represent milestones along that journey. So the first inflection point was back in 2006, and that was with the launch of the B Corp movement. And the B Corp stands for Benefit Corporation. And the idea behind a B Corp is that they're stopping and reevaluating the business to consider all of the stakeholders impacted by the organization and all of the stakeholders impacted by their actions. And if they can do that properly in the right governance, they can be classified as a B Corp. And so I think the B Corp was really a major awakening back in 2006 of this whole need to be stakeholder aware. Then the second inflection point happened about 9 years later in 2015, when the United Nations launched its new Sustainable Development Goals. Previous, they had the Millennium Development Goals, but in 2015, they revamped that and launched the Sustainable Development Goals, of which there are 17, really trying to bring the entire Earth, the entire population up to the same level of where everyone is, you know, and more equality there, and leveraging a lot of new innovation along the way. So all the member states of the UN have signed on to that, and they all have to put forth their own plan that they're accountable to for how they're going to achieve those goals and so forth. Similar to that, the year later in 2016, the third inflection point was the Paris Agreement. And similarly, you know, this came from you know, came out of the United Nations as well, and this again was for organizations to, or sorry, nations to step forward and set specific goals for themselves for their actions to mitigate the you know, the consequences of climate impact, climate change. And so the Paris Agreement, again, I think was another point of awakening where nations are realizing we really have to work together to address these things. The fourth inflection point happened in 2019, and that was with the Business Roundtable coming out and saying that, you know, business serves a purpose other than just serving the shareholders. It serves all of the stakeholders, you know, the customers, the workers, society, the earth, and of course the shareholders. And this was major because Business Roundtable is made up of CEOs of major Fortune 500 businesses from around the world. And so to have this scale of business come in and basically reiterate what the B Corp was saying about 13 years earlier was a major stepping point forward. And again, I think a growth of this awakening and this realization in a much broader community with a much bigger impact. So the final inflection I've seen in my work is what I call an inflection curve, and it has to do with sustainable financing, specifically of infrastructure around the world. And there's come to be in the last 10 years much more availability of different forms of sustainable financing of new infrastructure, particularly in developing economies. And in particular, a couple of things like green bonds are being used to invest in specific environmental initiatives. And then in certain places we have PPPs, or public-private partnerships, where public sector and private sector are coming together to achieve infrastructure development that the private sector couldn't fund by themselves. So there's investment from the private sector to help make that happen. And all of these things are accelerating the availability of sustainable infrastructure, particularly in developing economies where they weren't otherwise available. So I think that, again, has been a part of this awakening and this inflection. And then the last thing I do in the chapter was I mentioned a number of different organizations that are joining along with us in this cause and in this purpose. And I won't list them here, but if you get the book and you look in the last chapter, there's a list of organizations that are all like-minded in this cause. And there's undoubtedly countless many others that are a part of it as well that, you know, we weren't able to capture. But so that's the point of this chapter. It's very important. So what we'd like to do now is shift gears a little bit in the last 15 minutes we have left, and answer some questions that have come in from the audience. And now I'm going to open this to all the authors to address, but I'll try to go through some of the questions that have been put into the chat, and then whatever author is willing can sort of jump in and comment on it. One of the questions was, what challenges has COVID-19 imposed on social innovation? Has it accelerated this, or has it caused it to lag behind? Any authors would like to comment on that?
I'll start and just say that it has accelerated a lot of artifact innovation, but in terms of social innovation, I would say that it has caused a forced retreat and reminded us of the need of community more than ever, right? And so just knowing that remembrance of how much we need each other is going to let us better design social innovations post-pandemic.
Okay.
Yeah, I would second that. I think that one of the things we've seen in this COVID time is that there's been a lot of people working from home that have relied on their social networks, and there have been new behaviors that have emerged that have not always been positive. Okay, I take the example of Robinhood again, where you have these individual investors that essentially form a spontaneous crowd and start investing in speculative things, and reap some negative consequences. So there's both good and bad. It certainly, from our client's perspective, has reinforced the idea that you don't need these big offices and going into work every day in order to get things done. and I think that can be both positive and negative. There's things that can be said about that, but it certainly has. It's been a forcing function for many of these things.
On an opposite side, the activist investor, which are investors that are investing in good in companies that have the ESG or societal impact, and they're purpose driven. That body of activist investors is growing dramatically. So on the good side, it is going to pull this need for corporations to get more purpose driven and to be socially more responsible. So that I see as a positive outcome in a sad kind of state of the world.
I think another thing that we're seeing now is similar to what happened during the so-called Great Recession of 2008. People lost great value in their retirement plans, and it caused them to reassess what the good life was. And prior to that, a lot of people would define the good life as having a nice home, having a nice car, having leisure time and possessions. And after that shock, that economic shock, they started to come back to some of the more traditional values, time spent with family and friends. And so I think we're seeing a same kind of thing now, is that with these kinds of disruptions, people come back to more what you could call traditional values or baseline values that relate to human connection and kindness and those sorts of things. When the other things, the trappings of life, the extras, if you will, the luxuries are taken away, people return to the things that make them human. So the longer a disruption lasts, the more long-term the personal values changes are, which I think can only accelerate what we're talking about, moral innovation and doing good things in the world. So as much as it's a disruptive time, I think it's an exciting time too.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, I think it's actually going to lead to a social and creative renaissance. Sometimes to have greatness come, we have to clear out all the difficult things, and it can be very, very difficult, of course, but to shock ourselves, as Steve was saying, into this new awareness, new consciousness, new possibilities sometimes requires something incredibly dramatic. And boy, we can't get much more dramatic than what we've experienced. And we see this actually in just our innovation projects. There are always those stages where you're depressed and you say this is not going to work and there's no end, and then all of a sudden somehow you manage to get through it. So I know for myself personally, I'm experiencing a creative renaissance as a result of this, and hopefully that'll manifest in how we help our clients.
Thank you. I wanted to jump to another question too, to get in here, and we had actually a couple of very thoughtful questions that came in from Mr. Muhammad Taibe that I think are excellent questions. And one of his questions I'd like for us to address is, how can you ensure that a governance framework is established for innovation? In other words, how to recognize what is ethical or good and what is not, in the organization? What type of governance framework can we put in place? Anyone?
Well, I think sort of one of the things that came to mind right away is the Indian wisdom of considering the consequences for 7 generations hence. So basically you really look at the very long-term implications rather than the immediate effect. And I think if really we made our decision with that in mind, a lot of things would not happen.
Right. I would add a little bit, which is Mike Pinder's chapter would talk about it most eloquently. If we change the inputs in the front end of the process to include that long-term view and the multiple ways to create value for all types of stakeholders, right? Again, the planet, all types of stakeholders, all types of vendors, everyone that's in community where these organizations do business, then if you're having those right inputs, it sets the governance and those become metrics that you can track along the path.
And I'm going to brag on my co-author, Larry Schmidt, and say that his framework in his chapter, there's a great diagram with that framework that is a very simple tool to help people think through potential future consequences, both positive and negative.
Maybe I'll just jump in quickly and say, simply there's 2 kinds of metrics that have a lot of use in organizations, and they're types of metrics rather than specific ones, but there are your impact metrics versus your activity metrics. So reporting on what you're doing, but also reporting on what impact you're having for each of the stakeholders within your systemic ecosystem. So this is really systems thinking with those 2 metrics in mind, to be able to track what's happening and what impact is being felt throughout an innovation progress program is very useful.
I'll just throw 2 things in here real quick. One is it's clear that you can't be purpose-driven in a company that is itself purely profit-driven. It's virtually impossible. The governance has to come from the top, and it has to be cultural. The second thing I'll just say is, kind of as a thought piece, I kind of imagined what would a purpose-driven gun company look like? Now, for those of you overseas, you probably don't understand the US gun culture here, but think of a company like Remington. They could be a perfectly great ESG company. They could pay their workers well. They could not pollute. They could be sustainable. They could be all of those things that you measure, and yet they still produce semi-automatic guns, all right? Is that a purpose-driven company? Okay, we can't confuse purpose-driven with things like ESG and corporate social responsibility and stuff. And it's good to think through those thought exercises to really kind of tease out what it is you really mean by purpose-driven.
It's a good point, and I think you also, and you addressed what you alluded to at first in your chapter, that the governance and linking purpose into innovation and growth has to really start at the top of the organization. The senior leaders have to be themselves purpose-driven, and they have to make the organization purpose-driven. And and that's not necessarily at the expense of profit. They can do both. But if I'm just the individual innovator and I'm trying to drive this in an organization that whose leaders are not focused on this, I'm going to be pushing the rope. I'm not going to get far. It's going to just end up banging my head on the wall. And so, innovators who are purpose-driven would need to find themselves working in organizations that are likewise purpose-driven, whose leaders are purpose-driven. And there's a lot of great examples of that. One of the examples given here by one of Chadrat Nagpal, made the comment that Unilever is a good example of being both purpose and profit focused. And I think that's the kind of the balance we're looking for. organizations and their leaders have to be purpose-driven and set up a purpose-driven organization. In an environment like that, purpose-driven innovators can really thrive and be successful. And
Yeah,
then,
Anthony, I just wanted to say too, that I really think it's even more important now that leaders create the space and the time for their coworkers to do this work, to really the thought experiments that are required, role playing, scenario planning, whatever you call it. Oh my God, we are so busy and we're so trying to check the box on all these things that I think more and more and more and more leaders need to create those spaces for their coworkers to do all this kind of upfront thinking that all of us are talking about in the book.
Actually, if I just can quickly build on that, I absolutely agree. And I think one of the key reasons why we need to make more time and create more space is that in the highly complex environment that all of us are operating, it does not help to run faster. Actually, the only thing that will help you survive in a complex environment is to slow down. Because if you just run fast, if everything is happening so fast and you run fast, then the system will have changed and you've run off in an entirely different direction before you notice that the change has happened. So, creating space to reflect, to notice, and to observe, I couldn't agree more.
So I was going to add the ethics part of this, because we talk a lot about profit, but ethics sometimes, even though we think it's a forethought, it becomes an afterthought. And an example of that would be like an RFID tag that has an antenna that tracks individuals through the stores and then back home. And that if you don't put ethics first, you don't understand the repercussions of privacy and data and thinking through those things. And in the case of this particular RFID company, they created a tag where part of the tag could be ripped off, so it cut the antenna distance down, and so you're not capturing any of the personal data as someone leaves the store. And so just keeping that in the forefront is really important.
yeah, very good. And we're going to take one last real quick question. One of the questions put forth was, how do we actually measure this quantitatively? And I think Mike kind of hit on that. He says there's two types of metrics. There's activity metrics and there's outcome metrics. And when I work with our clients in the work I do, I always say you have to track the actual impact of what you're doing. And that could be financial and economic impact, that could be social impact, that could be environmental impact. But you have to know, all the impacts, and you need to track them. And so, I think the burden on organizations is to figure out, okay, once we do a new innovation, how are we actually going to track the actual impacts it has financially, economically, environmentally, and task themselves with tracking those things, and over time learning from that and becoming better at having the right types of impact. Anyone else want to comment on the whole measurement process?
Yeah, I think you got that exactly right, is tracking and stuff. And one of the things that companies find hard to do is to track things once they're out in the wild, okay? Once they've been released and are being used and stuff. You run into a lot of situations where customers will use a company's products in ways that the company never anticipated or expected or thought about. And the companies only find out about that much later and react to it. So it's a difficult thing to do, and I'm not sure anybody has solved that problem yet, is how to measure impacts down the road.
Larry, I was going to add to that, because I agree. I also think that a lot of times when we're working with certain customers, the metrics that they want to gather are not necessarily clearly laid out. And so if you can define those metrics more clearly, what's important to society, what's important to the company, you will have a better shot at getting the kind of data and measuring success that you want.
So very good. So yeah, for sure, I think those metrics need to be tied back to what our values are. We need to be tracking the impact as they relate to our values and our purpose. So I think with that, that's pretty much it for today. I'm going to encourage everyone here to pick up a copy of the book. I put the links in the chat window. You can buy it either on Amazon or directly from GI&I. And I just want to thank everyone for your contributions for this. We have recorded this. We will be distributing it to all the people who registered for it, for all those who weren't able to make it. And I think this has been a very excellent discussion today. And I want to thank all the authors for their time and their contribution, and all of our audience. Thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Anthony.
Thanks very much, Anthony. Thank you,
Thank you.
everyone.
Goodbye.
Thanks,
Cheers,
everyone.
everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.